and welcome from Dario Betti, the CEO of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. So welcome to one of our webinars. And today we talk about the workplace and messaging at work. As we are talking about this, and we'll have some interesting trends and surveys on how things have changed in the last few years. All of us are changing possibly our workplace. The coronavirus is making a bit of a change to our lifestyle and the way we work. So, probably comes this reflection how things are going is very timely. And very timely that we have some of the work from MEF in terms of the reports done from Inside Angels. Barbara Langer from Inside Angels is here, one of the co-founder of his analysts and agency looking at the inside. We also have the industry representative from Harsh Mamgain. Harsh is here from Infinite Conversion, the company, but also brought us NetSphere, one of the clear workplace solution and platform. So we have interesting information to share with you, but I would like to ask Barbara and Harsh to say a few words. Barbara, can you introduce yourself to the MEF community?
Sure, thank you, Dario. Well, yes, good afternoon or good morning to everyone. So yes, as Dario said, I'm a co-founder of Insight Angels, a research and insight agency. My background is in market research, understanding consumer attitudes and behaviours in all sorts of sectors, including mobile, technology, retail, etc. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to collaborate on this topic.
And great, and Harsh, thank you for joining us as well. And you're one of the sponsor of these reports. Thank you very much to help us to bring it here. And well, you've been involved in MEF for a long time, so we're very happy about that. Your experience goes across the multiple years. So thanks again, and thanks for bringing us a bit of a real life experience behind what's really about products to help the IT, but really the work people, the people behind it in companies to actually be more productive and more free and more compliant, I guess. So how would you describe what you're doing to somebody when you meet it for the first time?
Thanks, Dario, for the introduction, and thank you for all for joining this webinar. Just to add to what Dario mentioned, I head product and marketing for Infinite Convergence, and what we do is we enable messaging platforms for carriers and also comprehensive end-to-end communication platforms for enterprises. We have a range of products and services, and have been in mobility and messaging, working with MEF for the past many years now. So looking forward to this discussion here.
Well, great. And thanks both for you for being here to take us through what is, I believe, a very interesting, by the way, and full of information, fully packed paper. Barbara, will you be able to take us through some of the high-level summaries of this paper?
Yes, absolutely. So let's get stuck right in. I mean, just to start off, some broad stats to be aware of. Here we're looking at the percentage using a mobile device for work by country among smartphone users. And so you can see here that across the 10 countries that we had in the study, 56% of smartphone users are using a mobile for work. And so what we see is, in fact, that the developing countries such as China and India are among those with the highest levels of work mobile usage, while more developed countries are slightly behind in following this trend at the moment, but we expect that to evolve rapidly. So the majority are using smartphones for work-related communications. It's a really fundamental shift that seems to be happening, and even before the advent of the coronavirus. And what we're going to do now is go through some other data points and some important consequences of this trend.
Yeah, well, let me stop you there for a second and ask Harsh directly, because it's important. We see 56% globally the first time, so it means that really, despite coronavirus, but the mobility is already happening and was already happening at a high speed. Does that surprise you, Harsh?
No, you're right. It has been happening, and I believe actually it's the other way around. I think workplace has become more a part of the mobile. Uh, uh, so the mobile devices that we carry today are just not mere devices. They are very high, like high computing. They are high computing devices, which can enable all kind of applications, whether it's communication applications or you're talking about productivity applications, software as a service providers, those applications. So the work has actually moved to mobile, and the data here kind of indicates that. But I think the impact of mobility is much beyond this data here. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And sorry, but here is a chance for you to continue, Barbara, and I will continue to interrupt at some point. So,
No, absolutely, go ahead. And what we find as well is that many employees are using their own device for work, and that's for a variety of reasons. In some cases, of course, it's because they have to. They may be self-employed, or their employer might not provide them with a phone, but actually a really strong driver is that they want to. They want to have their own number, they want to use the apps that they like, and that's especially true in China and Japan. But there are generally a few differences by market in terms of what drives this behavior. But actually employees actually preferring to use their own devices for these types of reasons is a fairly constant driver. And one of the reasons why we think bring your own device as a policy is here to stay. So we asked users as well how they communicate for work when using their mobile device, and this finding shown on the slide was one of the interesting revelations. The fact that messaging apps have now actually overtaken email in a mobile work context. So half of smartphone users using a mobile device are communicating via messaging apps such as WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, etc., ahead of email. And that's a really key shift, because obviously email has just been the way we communicate in digital workplaces since the 90s. But now what we see is that when it comes to mobile work communications, these non-regulated consumer messaging apps such as WhatsApp have become extremely pervasive, and furthermore, the very straightforward ability to share digital documents, for example, via messaging apps, makes passing on attachments, documents, pictures, other potentially sensitive information very easy, and is becoming very commonplace as well.
well, this is something that does surprise me. I was not surprised as much to see that the mobility is coming everywhere, including the workplace. But I have to admit that I did not expect to see consumer messaging applications to be bigger than email. That's quite something. So, Harsh, are we onto something? Is that real? Is it really happening out there?
No, it is absolutely happening, and we have seen that paradigm shift in last 2 years. I mean, if you look at the data on the slide, itself is very telling. Like, between text messages and consumer messaging apps, you can see the dominance of messaging. And if you really look at it, today messaging is just not only the most popular app on a smartphone, it is the most preferred way of communicating, right? And and I would say email has its own place, right? But in addition to email, which is messaging is not only asynchronous like email, it brings in the environment of instant messaging, right? It brings an instantaneous environment for people to communicate in a very contextual manner, right? And it brings the immediacy to any conversation. So what that does is it takes away the formality of conversation, and and then in this environment, like it's a not only it's a very satisfying experience, like from a communication perspective. This environment creates a huge opportunity for productivity gains and collaboration. And today, if you look at the messaging platforms, they are not just limited to messaging like or text like email is. The messaging platforms are powering video conversations, like the video channel, the voice channels, like in the same environment where there is no friction, have become even more productive. So, so you will see, like I think email will still stay relevant, but the dominance of messaging has been going on, and like we can see that in the data. So I'm not as surprised to see that. I expect to see that in the reports, but like I'm glad that like it kind of the report kind of aligns with what we have seen in past couple of years.
Oh, great. So this is just the beginning. Oh, great. So Barbara, back to you.
So now we come on to some really important findings on potentially the resulting risks for employers. And the first of these is that those who use a mobile for work actually report higher than average exposure to fraud or attempted fraud, by which we mean things like SMS phishing, my account being hacked, credit card being used without my knowledge. So those using a mobile for work, the darker blue bars here, are more likely to experience all of these things. And in total, 59% said that they had experienced one or more of those things, compared to only 45% among people who don't use a mobile for work. It's a really interesting point. Of course, it may be a function of their profile. We know, for example, that people using a mobile for work are generally more active users of digital services, but regardless of the cause, the fact is there's real exposure here for enterprises. And if we just flip to the next slide, to reinforce some of this risk as well. The fact is the employees using their mobiles for work are not necessarily in the know about security. So we asked them, do you feel the data you share via mobile is secure when you're communicating for work? The majority either do not think it is or do not know. And there's a worrying 7% who simply don't care. So there's a really clear need for enterprises to regain control of their data and really educate the employees on some of these issues. So moving on to a related topic of data control, I think it's fair to say that professional email protocol is far more established than that of consumer messaging apps, which we've seen more employees are now using. And for some employers, that means a degree of control may have slipped away, and that's leading to reactive and potentially inconsistent policies being applied in order to try to safeguard sensitive information under GDPR, for example. And among employers who are taking some form of action to try and safeguard information, around a third have asked employees to remove a colleague from a messaging app chat group. About 1 in 5 have asked them to delete information or contacts. And the tricky thing is that there's no certainty that these actions are being consistently applied. They may be very reactive, firefighting, so to speak, and therefore inconsistent, open to lapses.
What you're describing there, Barbara, is a bit concerning. So you're saying that actually there is a lot happening of fraud in the real world. There are some reactions that could not be said, let's say, very scientific. It's a bit of oops, we have a problem, so we better be dealing with something. That would potentially put at risk the information on a company, the information of the employee themselves, or some of the privacy. Some of the fraud might be happening as well. So good things that we are seeing mobile taking over. Great stuff in terms of productivity might be that messaging, which is such an easy way to spread information, is taking place, but there is another side. And Harsh, give us some real examples. Have you seen something like that? Do you know of issues and how are companies managing this?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at what you have on the slide, this is a very scary scenario for almost every enterprise, right? Especially, I would say, in verticals. If you look at finance or healthcare verticals, all of the actions that employees are taking, nobody should be doing that. No enterprise should be allowing their employees to take these actions. And these actions should always be in enterprise control, and for very good reasons. Here you are playing with very sensitive confidential data, which is a company data. And in case of healthcare and finance, there are huge consumer privacy issues. So if you look at what we have seen some. I can give you one quick example here. Not to take too much of time, but we had a group of customer account teams of a very big partner, at global scale, and they were exchanging a lot of intelligence on a WhatsApp group. And then in the WhatsApp group, they were collaborating because messaging allows you to collaborate and exchange real-time information on global bits. But when they had employees leave the conversation in a WhatsApp group, HR was not there to provision that. Enterprise had no control over employees leaving. And when employees leave, most likely they join competitors. And that's exactly what happened. Information gets compromised, your data has been compromised. You don't even know the extent of damage you have caused to the company and to your own customers. So yes, huge problems. We see that, and especially in healthcare too.
Understood. So real life examples, things are really happening there. Apologies, Barbara, I keep on stopping you, but here we go. The floor is back for you.
That's okay. I think this is the last data slide. We just wanted to share this piece of data as well, that we're seeing employers beginning to embrace messaging apps. Already we see that users like to use them, but also globally, 47% say their employer has actually defined a preferred messaging app for work communications. That's among those who are taking some kind of action. There's some variance by country. So we see a higher proportion in China, 64%, and it's lowest in the UK and Germany. So choosing a preferred app may be a good first step for employers, but the thing to add is that we don't know the nature of those apps, if those apps are secure. It is quite possible still that even after they've defined a preferred app, they don't have the secure systems in place to make sure that the communications are secured. So it's encouraging in one way, but it may be for more practical reasons that they do this, and to align employees into using the same mode of communication rather than necessarily, we don't know, thinking about secure communications. That was actually the last data point I was going to share before we move on to the implications, unless there's any other questions you wanted to mention, Dario.
Well, I won't interrupt you just now, so but let me ask somebody else to do. To all of our participants online right now, please do ask questions. As a matter of fact, the report, which is available, and you will see it soon, there's a link to that on MEF. You can download it. It's freely available for you. Please do download it. But the report itself is very exhaustive. There's a lot of information out there, so do take the chance and ask Barbara now here. If you have any questions, I'll be very glad to share it. If not, we will start talking about the implication for the industry itself. So Barbara, can you take us through that, or should I introduce it? I'll leave you and Harsh discussing it if you want.
As you wish. Happy to kick off and see how we go. So the first point here is that mobile workforce is a good thing. It's something that we are seeing. It's not going to stop. It's going to equally reach all the markets, even if they're at different stages right now in terms of uptake. There are lots of productivity gains through mobile workforces that have been proved in multiple studies. So it's a trend that we need to support, and that isn't going away anytime soon. And as we alluded to earlier, will be no doubt accelerated by the current coronavirus situation. I don't know if you guys have any points to add.
Well, from my side, as a mobile ecosystem firm, we've seen mobile everywhere. It's in our DNA, and we've seen it growing of importance. It's interesting that from what we've seen, some of the mobile first countries are probably the one that have made the first steps, but also because of a lack of fixed resources in that case. But no surprisingly, the real big thing is, resource reach, the first word, is now embracing mobile as well. And that's what we've seen. That is very important to see. You can't stop it. It's happening anyway. It doesn't happen to be just a result of availability by now of resources. So as you were saying, plenty of studies from math. This seems to be a very easy, suggestions of embracing mobile.
Yeah, no, I agree. And especially in this environment, we are talking about mobile workforces. When it really comes to communication, we are seeing the adoption of mobile first or messaging first communication platforms, and I think that's a good segue into the next finding here, where the messaging revolution is taking over the workplace. It has actually taken over, but enterprises need to do a quick check on their mobile policies, because the takeover has happened from the from the consumer messaging applications, and which is what has put a lot of the enterprise data at risk. So the messaging revolution is already there. Your employees today are using consumer messaging apps, and that's the problem that I'm highlighting today. That what businesses really need is an enterprise-grade platform, which is not only secure and compliant, but they have it gives the businesses control over their own communication and on their own data, and so that they can protect the data and protect the consumers and their business partners.
Now, I think what you're saying there, Harsh, is important, as in the revolution has taken place. Messaging is the medium, but do we really understand fully what it means, each one of ours and in our company, and what it exposes us in terms of threats and compliance issues and so on? So I think there's a big analysis piece that needs to be done now. And so many of us are going to start using messaging and have our application at home to do it. And yet we don't know what we are exposing ourselves and our companies to that. So I think a bit of internal analysis really needs to take place now, as you're suggesting there, Barbara, as well. Very good. We haven't talked about bring your own device too much, Barbara, in this presentation. There are more slides. You did mention it, but then you're here with, and we agree, obviously, as math, there is no point of fighting it. There is a lot of positiveness. At least users seem to embrace it and want it.
That's right. Bring your own device is pretty prevalent everywhere. so we have to embrace it, because it's really driven by what users want to do, and what's practical for them. To some extent, you could see it as a moot point insofar as even if company devices were there, people are still going to use their own apps. You have to secure both the device and the apps on it, whether it's people's own device or a company provided device. So in the end, enterprises are going to have to account for these different scenarios.
And we go back to talk about security, because security is the biggest threat. So we need to look at it. So a lot of things we can do. Maybe let's ask Ash as well. What would you say that needs to be paramount in terms of security for companies? Well, what do you think the implications are?
So, so the first thing that enterprises need to do is have control over their own communication platforms or on their own data, right? With BYOD, becomes more challenging. But then, if you have the right tools and right application, then you can take the benefits of BYOD, right, and have the right tools of communications and secure your data too. Encryption, your security policies or encryption policies that these applications provide are going to be the key. And that's what we have done, for our enterprise state messaging platforms. Not only we provide the best industry-leading encryption and security policies, we also give an enterprise an absolute control over their own messaging service or on their own communication platform. And if you look at the messaging platforms today, the amount of data and the files that are exchanged, it's enormous, right? And not having the control, not having the policies that can be implemented so that you're compliant with GDPR requirements, HIPAA requirements, like other financial verticals who are also struggling with these requirements. And we have seen the instances where Deutsche Bank and Citibank, both had banned mobile messaging because they didn't have control over the data, and their BYOD phones did not provide them the security that is absolutely mandated for businesses or verticals like that. So yes, security has to be the number one, as always, whenever you are dealing with any data.
Well, and I do like the last point of education. That's what MEF is all about. So I think we'll be very good to open the doors again to these discussions, make sure that the message is there. Once again, do download the paper, share it, and show the real numbers and what they entice people to do. So we will, as MEF, support the education part. I hope that we've answered a lot of questions, but much more was in the paper. So let me ask for now, for you participants, if you have any questions. If not, I have a couple that I'll ask myself, but do hit the, I believe, the Q&A button, ask us questions. Meanwhile, I think to start with Harsh, but it could be both. It could be more about the real experience. It could be more Harsh. You mentioned the verticals just now in your examples. And, this survey looks at the user, the consumers, the employees in general. But how is it different between different verticals, finance or healthcare industry, etc.? Would you be able to give us a bit of flavors in there?
Yeah, sure. If you look at finance or healthcare, right, in both the verticals, the enterprises or the businesses are dealing with consumer data, and any consumer data that relates to finance or healthcare is very highly regulated. The financial data, especially for the enterprises, also is very highly regulated. Now, so the demand for a communication platform which gives them the security and the compliance and the things that we talk about is much more in healthcare and in finance. So these two verticals, very highly regulated. the compliance requirements, the fines that associated fines for not being compliant are huge, and that's where you see the demand of enterprise businesses struggling to meet those requirements. But if you look at other verticals like hospitality or logistics, there it's not as much as security and privacy because they don't use that amount of data. It's not exchanged over communication platforms with like frontline workers or employees on the field. And there, the ease of use, the user experience, and even the collaboration workflows, that becomes more important. So there are different verticals, like one communication platform that is secure, allows you to collaborate. It's it's regulated. It allows you to mandate the policies. It allows you to do everything, but every vertical has a different view of what they really need from that communication platform.
Well, let me ask you then, thanks for verticals. If everybody has got a different view, well, would you say that similarly every country might have a different stage? I mean, in terms of geography, something that Barbara, you've mentioned it before, there are some differences there. But what would you be able to say at a high level, which is there some grouping? Is there some differences in there?
Yeah, there are. There are. I mean, obviously, the big one is that the countries are all at different starting points in terms of the level of people using their mobiles for work. And it's the developing markets which are really leading there due to the lack of fixed line infrastructure. So very high usage: China, India, South Africa, Brazil. Relatively lower usage in UK, France, USA, and Japan, for example. I guess the key thing, though, is that the trend is the same, even if the countries are at different points. So those lagging countries are likely to catch up at some point. Outside of that, there are some market differences which are in the full report, which are quite interesting. So in terms of the usage of messaging apps for work, for example, we saw globally that's at 50%, but the proportion is actually far higher in some places such as South Africa, Brazil, Spain and China, some of the markets we just saw. And it's lagging behind in USA, UK, France and Japan. So there are some interesting groupings. And for the USA in particular, there's an interesting quirk, which is that people there are much more likely to embrace traditional email and text messaging as the way in which they communicate versus on mobile. So that's just a couple of the highlights. But yeah, there are these groupings there.
Harsh, you've got some comments on these countries?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at in the US, because of the HIPAA requirements, the regulatory requirements or the regional requirements for the healthcare providers was a lot more stringent, like 2 years back. But ever since you have had the rollout of the GDPR requirements, we are seeing the same trend in Europe, where a lot of the healthcare and hospitals and service providers are now really struggling to find solutions to keep up with the GDPR requirements. So that's been a regional shift. We saw that more in the North Americas first, now in Europe, and a lot of the companies today are global. When they have their regional offices in Asia Pac region. So not as much as in Asia Pac, the regulatory requirements are not really compliance or regulatory requirements driven interest. It's still got to do more with cost effective, very easy to deploy, and ability to roll out globally. So that drives a lot of the requirements from that region. But I think the trend has been towards more compliances for especially driven by consumer privacy today. And I think we will start seeing that in the Asia Pac.
Okay. Well, the last thing that some might say about messaging in general, which is it's a great phenomenon, but it's really demographically a young thing. Now, is there a bit of a bias there, or is it really happening everywhere? Question to both of you. Barbara, to start, obviously.
I had a little dig into the data on this, and super interesting. So email definitely more prevalent among older users, but messaging apps have pretty broad appeal across all of the age bands. There's no consistent trend to older or younger. It's certainly not the preserve of the young. So messaging app usage is here to stay, and it's making inroads among all demographics from what I can see in the data.
So it's really happening. Harsh, is that true from your experience as well?
Absolutely. I think messaging has transcended the demographics, right? So I think it goes without saying that the coming generations who are growing with messaging today and will predominantly be the part of the workforce, but the ubiquity of or the ease of use of messaging or the wide adoption that we have seen in the messaging has really transcended the demographics. So yes, younger people who grew up with messaging, right, will predominantly use a lot more of messaging, but the adoption of the messaging has been across all demographics.
Well, great. I would thank you, both of you. I know that our timing is kind of coming to an end, but there is a lot of insights that are very valuable, I think, for everybody. Whether you work in a company or whether you are in the IT department making some choices, it turns out that we take it as for granted as messaging around actually has got consequences and it puts the entire company at risk. And we might want to think twice on what's happening every day. Enjoy the productivity, the ease of use, but at the same time make sure that all of the nuts and crosses are crossed and considered. So I'd like to thank Barbara for the work in putting together all of this data and the report, which is now available on the MEF website to download. I'd like to thank Harsh to bring back some of the real life perspective on what's happening out there. So both of you, thank you very much. And on that, I'd like to welcome to, who knows, maybe more information next about the trends and the development in this industry, which is changing, as we know, on the day, thanks to the recent development. So thank you again, both of you, and to everybody who has joined us today online and later in our webcast across the MEF and webcast and webinar and a podcast as well as we have right now. That is going to follow through MEF in all of our platforms. So thank you again. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.